A stray dog walked into a house. What happened next will shock you. It was nearly midnight when the dog first appeared, a bedraggled silhouette on the porch, illuminated by the flickering motion sensor light. The house itself was silent, tucked away on the outskirts of town where no one ever ventured this late. And yet here was this strange, trembling creature, staring at the locked door as if it had every right to be there. Something about its posture was uncanny. The dog's head was bowed, as though weighed down by eons of regret, or perhaps humility. Its fur, matted and damp from the night's drizzle, shone a dull brown where it wasn't caked in mud. The pattering of rain on the porch roof provided a haunting soundtrack, a soft, steady beat that underlined the dog's every breath. Anyone who saw it might have thought it a ghost, a spectral warning from some forgotten tragedy. But it was all too flesh and blood. And on the other side of that door was a secret that would soon be laid bare, not just for the family inside, but for anyone who heard the story later. Little did anyone know that this night, so seemingly unremarkable, was about to deliver a series of shocks that would leave hearts pounding, tears flowing, and lives forever changed. Inside the house, tossed and turned on the living room couch, she had dozed off while working on an article for the local newspaper, her laptop still open on the coffee table. The faint buzz of insects outside, the quiet hum of the fridge in the kitchen, it was all typical background noise in this rural hideaway. The family home was older, with creaky floorboards and thin walls that whined whenever the wind picked up. Even so, had grown used to the sounds. They were, if nothing else, comforting. They reminded her of better times, before her father's sudden passing left her mother, with an empty heart and unspoken grief. Before her younger brother, Todd, into his own world, burying himself in music through ever-present earbuds. Before their sense of security was shattered like glass dropped from a great height. Was a journalist by heart, curious, determined, unable to let a mystery remain unexplored. She stirred at the faint, scrabbling noise at the front door, the noise that slipped into the house as softly as an intruder might. It was quiet yet urgent, like a gentle scratching that refused to stop. Half awake, rose and peered through the curtains. That was when she spotted the dog. For a moment her heart stuttered. Something about the way it stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes wide, screamed helplessness. But more than that, there was a ripple of strange intensity behind its gaze, as though it recognized or sensed in her a kindred spirit. She could see the creature was frightened, its ribs showing through the patchy fur, each breath ragged. Acting on pure instinct, she carefully unlatched the door and opened it just a crack, mindful that a wild, desperate animal could bolt inside and cause chaos. The dog looked up, locked eyes with her, and in that single moment swore she felt a spark of something, familiarity or fate. She couldn't quite describe it. All she knew was that her heart quickened and her skin prickled. Some primal part of her recognized this as the start of something momentous. Behind her, footsteps approached. Emerged from her bedroom in a worn bathrobe, her hair askew, eyes heavy with the fatigue of a woman who hadn't slept peacefully in years. She called in a hushed voice, uncertain whether she was addressing her daughter or a dream. "What's going on?" Didn't respond right away. Instead, she knelt down and extended her hand, palm upward. The dog sniffed at her fingers through the gap in the doorway. Its nose was cold, and the contact sent a jolt of compassion surging through his veins. "There's a stray dog," she whispered, trying not to sound too excited or too apprehensive. "I think it hurts." Indeed, now that she was closer, could see small droplets of blood mingling with the mud in the dog's fur. Bruises, scrapes, and other signs of abuse or neglect seemed to decorate its body like a tragic mosaic. Pressed her lips together, torn between motherly protectiveness and empathy for this broken creature. Before she could respond, Todd's door creaked open upstairs. He must have heard the soft commotion, because now his lanky figure appeared at the top of the steps, earphones still around his neck. His bleached hair was messy, his eyes half-lidded. "What's all the noise?" He mumbled, sounding more curious than annoyed. He trudged down the stairs, peered around, and flinched slightly at the sight of the dog. He loved animals, but he rarely admitted it out loud. In typical teenage fashion, he tried to mask his softer emotions under a veneer of aloofness. Yet the sorrow emanating from the dog felt almost tangible, and Todd found himself swallowing hard, an unexpected wave of compassion choking him. In the hush of the moment, with rain softly tapping the roof and the house bathed in the glow of a single lamp, the three exchanged a silent look, gave a slight nod as though granting permission, opened the door fully. The dog stepped inside. The warmth of the house must have felt like paradise compared to the chilly midnight air, because the dog immediately sagged with relief, its legs trembling under the sudden shift. Was the first to gently place a hand on the creature's back, ignoring the grime. Her eyes softened. Despite the heavy load of grief she carried daily, his capacity for kindness remained remarkable. But almost as soon as the dog entered the house, an odd feeling washed over the family. It was as though someone had taken a deep breath of relief, but the exhale belonged not to any of them, nor to the dog. It was intangible, a shift in energy, a subtle quake in the foundation of their shared existence. They felt it in the air. The dog's presence was more than a random stray, yet none of them could articulate this sensation, so they simply focused on caring for the unexpected visitor. Was the first to act. She grabbed an old towel from the hallway closet, kneeling on the floor to wipe away the mud and blood from the dog's fur. With each gentle stroke, she felt the knotted tension of the dog's muscles loosening ever so slightly. Todd hovered nearby, occasionally reaching out to help, and disappeared into the kitchen to fetch something for the dog to eat. The hush in the room thickened, as though even the walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Examined the dog's injuries more closely. Some were fresh, some half-healed. She guessed it had been on the streets for months, possibly years. But the fresh wounds, what caused them? A fight with another dog, an abusive owner, a near-fatal encounter with a moving vehicle. It was impossible to tell. Yet all of these possibilities flickered behind his eyes, fueling her compassion until it threatened to spill over into tears. As the dog ate the food set out, a bowl of leftover chicken and rice, the entire family observed, feeling a flutter in their chests as they watched life returning to the creature. Each bite, each swallow, felt like an act of trust. And Todd all exchanged silent glances that said, "We have to keep it. We have to protect it." But who would say it aloud first? A rush of excitement warred with a twinge of fear, because inviting a strange dog into their already fragile household could either mend what was broken or shatter it further. After losing her husband, had turned inward, rarely letting new joys or new sorrows penetrate the protective shell she'd built around her grief. A dog might be exactly what she needed, or it could be another wound if something went wrong. After finishing its meal, the dog looked up, peering at each of them in turn. Its gaze was too wise, too conscious for a mere animal. There was a spark of gratitude, yes, but also something else, something akin to anticipation. As if it expected a next step, a purpose to fulfill here in this house. Outside, the rain began to pick up, thickening into a steady downpour. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that made the windows rattle. The dog's ears flattened momentarily, but it didn't cower. Instead, it stared at as though it recognized in her the matriarch, the decision-maker. Sighed. "We can't just turn it away," she said, voice quiet but firm. Todd nodded in agreement, managed a small smile, one that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "Let's see it through," she said, wiping her hands on the towel. With that, the dog was no longer just a stray. It was, in some unspoken way, theirs. They would give it shelter, at least for tonight, and see what tomorrow brought. Little did they know, tomorrow would bring revelations more shocking than any of them could have imagined. That night, as the dog settled onto an old blanket by the living room fireplace, tried to return to her couch to sleep. But sleep would not come easily. She felt compelled to watch over the dog, to to make sure it was still breathing, that it wasn't suffering in silence. She wondered if it had a name. She thought about the stories she might write if this dog turned out to be a local legend, lost and found under mysterious circumstances. Her reporter's instincts were alive and kicking, but so was her empathy. Meanwhile, Todd sat cross-legged on the floor, silently observing, occasionally humming some tune. Lingered in the doorway, arms folded over her chest, eyes distant. For a moment, worried her mother might be recalling the night her father died, late, unexpected, a final gasp echoing through these very walls. But didn't voice such thoughts. She merely stepped closer, gently patted the dog's side and whispered, "We'll figure this out together," as if speaking to the house itself or to the memory of her husband. Morning arrived, pale and tentative. The rain had ceased, leaving the yard wet and glistening in dawn's early light. The dog remained curled on the blanket, breathing softly, occasionally twitching in its sleep. Had dozed off, head resting on the arm of the couch. Had returned to her bedroom, Todd to his. The once quiet house now held a new occupant, and with it, a weighty sense of the unknown. When finally roused herself, she made coffee and warmed some oatmeal. The smell coaxed Todd downstairs, looking a little more awake but still overshadowed by the previous night's strangeness. As they sipped their coffee, they watched the dog stir, stretch, and slowly get to its feet. They decided they needed to check if the dog had a collar, some form of identification. Gently brushed aside the fur around the dog's neck, only to discover something that made her gasp. A thin, faded leather collar that had nearly fused with its fur. The collar looked ancient, with a small metal plate so scratched and rusted it was impossible to read any inscription. Yet it struck as odd that a dog so obviously homeless would still have this tattered emblem of ownership. She grabbed her phone, using the flashlight to inspect it. Then, noticing the collar's sorry condition, suggested they cut it off. The dog whined softly at the touch, as though the collar was a relic it wasn't quite ready to surrender. But seeing the kindness in its eyes, it gave a slight nod, if a dog could nod, and allowed them to proceed. The moment the collar came free, the dog let out a shuddering breath that sounded almost human, as though a spell had been broken. With that, their day began. Left for her shift at the local diner, Todd retreated to his room to scroll through social media and pick out new songs, and lingered with the dog, curiosity burning. She needed to know if there was a story here, a lost dog connected to an unsolved case, or an abused animal that might lead to an investigation. Was known at the paper for her tenacity. She could peel back layers of secrecy like paint from a cracked wall. But first, she had to gain the dog's trust and nurse it to health. She made a mental note to take it to the vet that afternoon. By midday, the sun had emerged fully, turning the morning's fog into a bright, breezy day. Rummaged through the garage for a leash, an old one from when Todd was younger, and had briefly convinced their parents to let him walk neighborhood dogs for pocket change. The dog seemed hesitant at first but followed outside. It sniffed the grass, the air, the porch steps as though reacquainting itself with the world. Noticed how it paused at certain spots, ears pricked, body tense, as if it sensed something invisible. She chalked it up to the dog's natural caution. As they walked around the yard, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being guided by the dog, rather than the other way around. Each new direction felt purposeful, like the dog had a map in its mind. It led her toward the fence at the back, near an ancient oak tree that had stood guard over the property for decades. The dog stopped, whined, and pawed at the base of the trunk, knelt down to see what had caught its attention. The ground was damp, covered in fallen leaves, but beneath that she noticed something odd. The slightest depression in the earth, as though something had once been buried there. Her pulse quickened. She brushed the leaves aside, revealing a patch of disturbed soil. She wasn't sure why, but an unsettling wave washed over her, as if she were reenacting a scene she'd only dreamt about. The dog whimpered again, pressing closer to her side. It stared at the patch of ground with an intensity that made tremble. Without quite knowing why, pushed the leaves away until she felt something solid under her fingertips. A piece of wood, chipped and decaying. She dug a bit more, her curiosity flaring even as a sense of dread tugged at her chest. Eventually, she uncovered what appeared to be a wooden box, small, padlocked, edges weathered by time. The dog sniffed it, whimpered again, then gently laid its paw on the box's lid. His heart hammered. What was inside? She tried to open the box, but the padlock was rusted shut. Gently lifted the box from the earth and carried it back into the house, the dog trailing behind, tail wagging in an odd mixture of excitement and anxiety. Once inside, she set the box on the kitchen table and examined the lock. It looked decades old, the metal flaking. With a set of pliers, she carefully the lock until it snapped. Then, breathing shakily, she lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of letters, handwritten on yellowing paper, tied together with a faded ribbon. Beneath them was a small cloth pouch that jingled when she picked it up. She placed the pouch aside for a moment and examined the letters. Her eyes scanned the top page, just enough to see that they were dated from over 20 years ago and addressed to "My Darling." A chill down spine. Was her mother's name. The handwriting wasn't, nor did it look like her late father's. A million questions swarmed in his mind. Who wrote these? Why were they buried? Eager to unravel the mystery, carefully slid the top letter from the stack and began to read. The first line made her stomach lurch. If you are reading this, it means I have gathered the courage to share the secret that has weighed on me for so long. The letter went on to describe a forbidden love, heartbreak, and references to a child that was never acknowledged publicly. His vision blurred with shock. Was her mother hiding something all these years? The dog watched her intently, as though understanding the emotional bomb that had just detonated. Time seemed to stand still as it devoured the letter's contents. A man named James wrote of his unwavering love for, and the shame he felt at never being able to claim her openly. He mentioned his fear of her father, grandfather, who had been vehemently protective and strict. There was talk of hush money, a threatened scandal that would have destroyed the family's reputation if certain truths came to light. Felt like she was reading a dark, one that threatened to upend everything she thought she knew about her family's history. Could it be that her mother's heartbreak wasn't solely about her husband's death, but also about this buried secret from decades before? Her hands shook as she opened the second letter, then the third. More revelations poured out. Had once been pregnant, but apparently lost the baby in a traumatic event that involved James. The details were vague, incomplete, smudged by what looked like tears. Yet the heartbreak was palpable in every word. His chest tightened painfully. Had her mother carried the weight of a lost child all these years, never speaking of it? The letters ended abruptly with a final note that read, "I can't bear to keep this hidden anymore. I'll bury these words under the oak, near the place you loved. If fate is kind, perhaps these truths will find the light someday." Lowered the page, tears gathering in her eyes. No one in the family had ever mentioned James. She suspected, and her father's grandfather might have made sure the secret stayed buried, both literally and metaphorically. The dog whined softly, pressing its nose against his leg. It was as if it had led her here, wanting her to uncover this hidden family history. But why? Was the dog connected to it somehow? Her rational mind told her that was impossible. But her gut insisted there was more to the dog's presence than mere coincidence. She picked up the cloth pouch next, heart pounding. Inside, she found a small gold locket and a ring. The ring was simple, unadorned except for an engraving on the inside. Forever, J and L's eyes stung with unshed tears. She recognized her mother's initials, but the other letter was obviously James. She wondered if had ever worn this ring. If so, she'd never shown it to her children, not even once. At that moment, the sound of a key turning in the front door lock startled. Stepped into the house, returning from her morning shift earlier than expected. Her cheeks were flushed from the cool air, and she set her purse down, looking weary. She froze when she saw at the table the open box, and the dog panting quietly by her side. "What is that?" asked, voice tight with alarm, turned to face her mother, trying to gather her courage. "Mom," she began carefully, "there's something you need to see." Without a word, crossed the room and peered into the box, eyes darting across the letters and the old pouch. Recognition flared. Her complexion drained of color so rapidly that thought her mother might faint. The dog let out a low, mournful howl, a sound that vibrated with heartbreak. Closed her eyes, tears escaping from beneath her lids. "Where did you find this?" she managed to whisper. Explained everything. The dog leading her to the oak tree, the discovery of the buried box, the letters from James. With each word's breath hitched until she finally sank into a chair, pressing a trembling hand to her forehead. For a long moment no one spoke, then began to talk haltingly at first about the summer she had met James. She'd been a bright, hopeful 17-year-old, engaged to his father in a match arranged by her parents. But James was the son of a traveling preacher, a charismatic young man who visited the town for a mere 6 weeks. Their love was sudden and intense, and though felt bound by family duty, she secretly hoped to break free. She discovered she was pregnant not long after James left, and she sent word to him. But's father intercepted the letter. He forced to keep quiet, threatening to disown her if she disgraced the family. In the end, lost the baby in a tragic accident, and in her sorrow, she reluctantly moved forward with her parents' plans, marrying's father months later. As poured out these long-buried secrets, her tears spilled freely, her voice trembling with raw pain. Listened, stunned. She had never suspected such heartbreak existed beneath her mother's gentle exterior. She also realized how her mother's grief over losing her husband might have been compounded by the memory of this other lost love, and a child that never saw the light of day. The dog remained silent now, its head resting on its knee as though to offer solace. Petted it absently, her gaze distant, lost in a swirl of memories. "I never thought these letters would resurface," she confessed. "I buried them with James under that oak tree after he gave them to me. We wanted to preserve the story of our love, but we also had no idea how to handle the situation. He left town soon after, and I couldn't bring myself to write to him again. The next thing I knew, your grandfather arranged the wedding. I felt trapped. I never told your father everything because I was ashamed." His heart twisted. She wanted to be angry at her mother for keeping such a monumental secret, but all she felt was sorrow and compassion. She moved closer, hugging from behind. In that wordless embrace, the weight of generational secrets seemed to lift, if only slightly. They were no longer hidden in the soil. They were out in the open, ready to be confronted and perhaps healed. That afternoon, stayed home from work, Todd skipped his music practice, and the three of them pored over the letters together. It was an emotional experience, one that left them all drained yet oddly unburdened. Throughout it all, the dog stayed at side as though it were her guardian. At one point, Todd wiped away tears, surprising. She rarely saw her stoic teenage brother get emotional. But these letters hit close to home. They explained, in part, why it had seemed so distant, so haunted all these years. As night fell again, thanked the dog quietly. She stroked its ears, whispering, "I don't know why you came to us, but you've already helped heal something I thought was broken forever." The dog gazed at her with patient, knowing eyes. Couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. Why now? Why had this dog, of all animals, decided to scratch at their door? Later, when lay awake in her bed, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The shocking revelations, the raw emotions, the sense of closure that had begun to form. But she also sensed another layer to the story, as though they had only peeled back the first page of a much larger book. That sense of the unknown deepened over the next few days. The dog's injuries healed with remarkable speed, and no missing pet advertisements or local inquiries matched its description. The vet confirmed it had no microchip. Each time took the dog outside, it guided her to some new corner of the property, sniffing and digging at the ground as if searching for more hidden clues. But they found nothing else. Life began to adopt a new rhythm. Was more open now, more vulnerable. She talked to and Todd about their father, about the regrets she had, about how she wanted them to live unburdened by secrets and shame. Todd began volunteering at an animal shelter after school, partly inspired by the dog's resilience. Worked on a personal essay about the experience, though she was torn about whether to publish something so private. Then came a night that threatened to undo all their progress. It started innocently enough. Todd was out with friends, and were watching a late-night documentary, and the dog was curled up contentedly at the foot of the couch. Around 11 o'clock, a fierce knock rattled the front door. Tensed, stomach flipped. Visitors at this hour rarely brought good news. The dog sprang up, ears alert, baring its teeth in a silent snarl at the door. Flicked on the porch light, only to see the silhouette of a man standing outside. His shoulders were broad and he clutched something, a hat, maybe, in his hands. Exchanged a worried glance with. Finally, bracing herself, cracked the door open. The stranger introduced himself as David, a private investigator hired to track down the owners of certain pieces of property. He produced a photograph, an old black and white image of a young couple standing near the oak tree in the backyard. It was, and James, though looked barely out of high school. David said he'd been tasked with finding a box rumored to contain letters and valuables belonging to James. Heart pounded. This was no coincidence. The dog stood at her side, a low growl rumbling in its throat as though it sensed a threat. His eyes widened. She tried to remain calm. "Why do you want them?" she asked softly, her voice betraying only a hint of anxiety. David explained that James had passed away years ago, but a relative recently discovered legal documents indicating a hidden inheritance. If or any descendant of hers was found, they stood to inherit a substantial sum. His stern gaze swept the hallway, as if he expected to see the letters or some sign of them. His lips parted. The weight of the revelation was too much. She motioned for David to come inside so they could talk more privately. Was skeptical. She didn't trust strangers who appeared unannounced in the dead of night, but insisted. They led him to the kitchen, where the dog positioned itself protectively at his feet. David laid out his evidence, official papers signed by James, references to a trust fund that had grown over 2 decades. His face paled. The mention of money was secondary to the memory of James, his letters, and the heartbreak. Watched her mother wrestle with a storm of emotions, guilt, longing, sorrow, and an odd glimmer of hope. Could this be a chance to honor the child she'd lost, or maybe to right some of the wrongs inflicted by her controlling father? But something about David felt off. He seemed more intent on confirming the box's whereabouts than on genuinely assisting with her inheritance. The dog never took its gaze off him. Finally, admitted she had the letters. David's eyes lit up with a disconcerting gleam. He demanded to see them, claiming he needed to verify authenticity. Hesitant, fetched the box and placed it on the table. David practically snatched the letters, flipping through them with a hunger that made skin crawl. The dog let out a sharp bark, startling him. David brushed it off, continuing to read the lines that bared soul. Wanted to protest. These letters were personal, not mere artifacts, but seemed resigned, as though she believed this was necessary to finalize whatever business James had left behind. When David finished, he closed the box and cleared his throat. "Ms.," he said in a tight voice, "it appears everything's in order. I'll need to deliver these to the law firm so they can confirm your identity. Once that's done," he paused, glancing at the dog. "Once that's done, you and your family will be quite wealthy." Hesitated, eyes flitting to the dog too. A wave of uncertainty gripped her. "Do I have to give you the letters right now?" she asked. David shrugged, adopting a businesslike tone. "The sooner we verify them, the sooner you can inherit." His intuition screamed that something was wrong. She caught the tiny twitch in David's jaw, the bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the cool room. The dog snarled again. No one else was focusing on the dog but felt its tension, its readiness to lunge if David made any sudden moves. Something primal coursed through the air, an unspoken standoff between the dog and the investigator. Then David abruptly snatched the entire box and stood, stammering something about returning with the final paperwork in a few days. His eyes widened. "Wait, you can't just—" But he was already heading toward the door, the letters clutched against his chest. The dog reacted first. It raced after David, barking ferociously. David twisted the doorknob and bolted outside. A struggle ensued on the porch, growls, scuffling, the clatter of something hitting the ground. Rushed to side, her adrenaline spiking. They heard David shout, the dog growl. Cried out, "Give me my letters." In a heartbeat, Todd's bedroom light flicked on and he appeared on the stairs, confused and alarmed. "What's going on?" he yelled. The scene on the porch turned chaotic as the dog lunged at David's arm, forcing him to drop the box. David swore, lashing out at the animal with a violent kick. The dog yelped, stumbling. A savage fury ignited in. This man was a thief, possibly a con artist, and now he was hurting the dog that had brought them healing. She ran outside, not even bothering with shoes, and tackled David with all her might. He stumbled, losing his grip on the box. It tumbled down the porch steps, letters scattering into the damp night air. Gasped and rushed to gather them, hands shaking. Meanwhile, Todd grabbed his phone to call the police. David tried to break free from his grip, but the dog bounded to its feet, teeth bared, blocking his path. Seeing no easy escape, David cursed under his breath, then dashed around the house, disappearing into the darkness. The dog followed, barking, but called it back. She had no idea if David had a weapon, better to let him flee. She sank to her knees, chest heaving, heart pounding. Hugged the scattered letters protectively. Todd hovered over them, phone in hand, speaking rapidly to a 911 operator. After the chaos subsided, they found themselves huddled in the living room, the dog still trembling with residual adrenaline. A police car arrived within minutes. Officers combed the property, but David was nowhere to be found. They took statements, examined the letters, and concluded David was likely an imposter, a scammer who had gotten wind of the rumored inheritance and decided to exploit secret. As the reality sank in, trembled. She'd nearly lost the last remaining pieces of her history with James. The shock of the ordeal left them all shaken, but an undercurrent of gratitude emerged. The dog had protected them, risking its own safety to reclaim the letters. Without its intervention, those precious documents, proof of his identity in relation to James, might have vanished forever. The next few days were a blur of investigations, phone calls to legitimate law firms, and anxiety about David's possible return. Yet one truth shone amid the confusion. The dog was more than just a stray. It was a guardian, a guide that seemed almost supernaturally attuned to the family's needs. Eva, who was practical to a fault, began leaving out extra treats, whispering words of thanks to the dog whenever she thought no one was looking. Todd insisted on naming the dog Hero, though, and toyed with other names. In the end, Hero stuck, simple, heartfelt, and undeniably true. But the biggest shock was still to come. On a crisp afternoon, about a week after the confrontation with David, a letter arrived in the mail. It bore official letterhead from a reputable firm known to handle inheritance disputes. Opened it cautiously, her eyes scanning the printed words. She gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Rushed to her side, reading over her shoulder. The letter stated that James had indeed left behind an inheritance, but it wasn't just money. It included a property in a nearby town and a heartfelt note addressed specifically to. Enclosed were copies of old documents verifying that his child would have been eligible for a trust fund. Though the child never survived, the trust still existed under his name. Tears streamed down his face. She wiped them away, letting out a choked sob that was equal parts sorrow and relief. All this time, a piece of James had lived on in the form of this gift he'd set aside. It was more than money. It was closure, a testament to the love they had shared. Over the next week, made arrangements to claim the inheritance properly. She engaged with the law firm, making sure every detail was handled without a chance for fraudsters like David to intervene. As the final documents came together, realized she had a choice. Keep these resources for herself or use them to create something that honored her lost child and the relationship she once had with James. With Todd's support, she decided on the latter. They planned to use a portion of the inheritance to fund scholarships at the local high school, especially for students who came from difficult backgrounds, the way James once had. Word of this philanthropic gesture spread through the community, and soon they found themselves at the center of attention. Reporters from nearby papers reached out for interviews, intrigued by the dramatic tale of lost letters, secret inheritances, and a stray dog that saved the day. The editor at the local newspaper urged her to write a personal piece. She hesitated. It was all so raw, so personal, but encouraged her, saying it might help others who harbored long-buried secrets and heartbreak. And so poured her soul onto the page, chronicling the night the stray dog appeared, the hidden box under the oak tree, and the miraculous chain of events that followed. When the article was finally published, it went viral in a way no one anticipated. Social media lit up with reactions, shock, tears, and messages of hope. People shared it far and wide, drawn by the emotional depth, the cinematic twists, and above all, the role of the mysterious dog that came to be known as Hero. The home was inundated with letters from strangers who felt inspired or healed by the story. Offers to adopt Hero poured in, but they dismissed them all. Hero was family. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink, stood by the oak tree where so much had been buried. She held the old letters and the ring James had once given her, tears slipping down her cheeks. She glanced at Hero, who sat quietly by her feet, then at Todd, who hovered a few steps behind, giving her space. In a trembling voice, read aloud passages from James's last letter, the one that spoke of eternal love of the child they lost, of the hope that their love might endure in some form beyond earthly limitations. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through, letting the words fill the evening air. When she finished, she placed the ring in a small container and gently pressed it into the soil at the tree's base. A symbolic gesture. She wasn't burying her love or her past any longer. She was laying it to rest in peace, acknowledging it fully so she could move on without shame or regret. At that moment, as if in response to this release of grief, Hero tilted its head to the sky and let out a long, soulful howl. It wasn't mournful. It carried an air of triumph, of gratitude. His heart twisted with emotion, and she reached for Todd's hand. Closed her eyes. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, rustling them in a gentle susurration that felt like applause from the universe. Or maybe it was the spirit of James, or the lost child, or the father they had also lost, all of them bearing witness to this act of courage and healing. It was a moment of profound connection that not one of them would ever forget. Days turned to weeks, and they adapted to their new reality with quiet amazement. The scholarship fund was formally established in the lost child's name, ensuring that future generations could find a pathway to a better life. Found peace in her memories, no longer haunted by the weight of secrecy. Todd seemed more open, more engaged with the world, less cynical. Writing flourished. Her viral article opened doors she never thought possible. The local paper gave her a promotion, and national outlets contacted her for freelance assignments. Yet she remained humble, attributing much of her success to a stray dog that just happened to walk into their home on a rainy night. As for Hero, the dog seemed to glow with renewed vitality, its wounds healed, its coat glossy. It became a beloved fixture of the household, a constant reminder that miracles often come in unexpected forms. Strangers would sometimes stop by just to catch a glimpse of the famous stray. Would watch as Hero greeted them with gentle curiosity, tail wagging. But no matter how many visitors came or how many offers to purchase or adopt Hero were made, the dog always returned to side, gazing up at her as though she were the entire world. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail from a small island community far away. The sender was someone who claimed to be James's distant cousin. She had read's article and wanted to share her gratitude for how had honored James's memory. Enclosed was a photograph of James in his final years, older, a bit grayer, but with the same warm smile had once fallen in love with. On his lap sat a dog that looks uncannily like Hero, right down to the soulful eyes and gentle ears. His breath caught in her throat, peered over her shoulder, stunned. Was it possible that Hero was related to that dog in the photo, or was it merely a coincidence? Goosebumps erupted on his arms. There was no way to know for sure, but the resemblance was uncanny enough to make them believe that perhaps there was a deeper connection, an invisible thread of fate weaving them all together. Nothing about Hero ever suggested an ordinary pet. The dog had arrived like a sign, guided them to hidden truths, protected them from deceit, and ushered toward a long-overdue confrontation with her past. Now this photograph suggested that Hero was, in some unfathomable way, an emissary from James, bridging time and distance to heal his wounded heart. The family chose to believe it. Why not? Life had already shown them that the most improbable events could be the catalysts for profound change. Not long after, decided it was time to share her own version of the story. She took to social media, something she'd never done before, and typed out a heartfelt post, complete with images of the letters, the ring, and, of course, Hero. She described how she'd spent decades hiding from her past, only to find it resurrected by the arrival of a stray dog. She spoke of love, loss, and redemption, urging anyone reading to confront their own buried secrets before they grew too heavy to bear. Within hours, her post went viral, gathering millions of views and reactions. People from all walks of life reached out with similar stories of hidden heartbreak, hidden loves, and the animals that seemed to appear in their lives just when they needed them most. Late that evening, Todd and Hero curled up in the living room, stunned by the outpouring of support. A video call from an elderly woman in a neighboring state came in. She claimed to remember James from his preaching days and said he always talked about a girl named back home. Seeing his face on social media, she broke down in tears of relief, finally understanding the end of that love story. Thanked her, tears streaming down her own cheeks. Hero laid its head on its lap, eyes half closed, as if satisfied that its mission was complete. But perhaps the most poignant moment occurred the following morning. Woke before dawn, unable to sleep, the moonlight streaming through the windows. She walked through the house, memories dancing in her mind. She paused at the living room fireplace where Hero had once lain, wounded and weary. The spot was empty, her chest constricted. She called out quietly, "Hero." But no answering bark came. A wave of dread pricked at her. She moved through every room, opening doors, checking closets, even stepping outside into the cool pre-dawn air. But Hero was nowhere to be found. Panic flared in her chest, and she roused and Todd. Together, they searched the property, calling the dog's name. Only silence answered them, save for the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. All day and into the evening, they searched the town, putting up flyers, calling neighbors, and checking the shelter where Todd volunteered. No one had seen Hero. It was as though the dog had vanished into thin air. A deep sadness fell over the household, the ache of losing yet another beloved presence. Tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Hero had found another family in need, or returned to wherever it came from. Wrote a post on social media pleading for anyone who had seen the dog to contact them. Dozens of tips poured in, but none led to Hero. Days passed, and the emptiness in the house became palpable. Was inconsolable, Todd withdrawn, devastated. It felt like an unfinished chapter, a song cut off mid-note. Then, exactly 1 week after Hero's disappearance, the family awoke to the sound of scratching at the front door, soft, insistent, like the very first night. Heart pounding, flung the door open. There sat Hero, battered, limping, but alive. Tears of relief poured from his eyes as she dropped to her knees. The dog pressed its nose against her cheek, letting out a soft whine that sounded almost apologetic. The rest of the family crowded around, each desperate to touch the dog they thought was gone forever. When carried Hero inside, she noticed fresh wounds, scrapes and cuts that looked like they might have come from brambles, or possibly a fight with another animal. But Hero was alive. That was all that mattered. Over the next few days, and tended to the dog's injuries, showering it with more love than ever. The mystery of where Hero had gone lingered in their minds, but they found a comforting narrative to explain it. Perhaps Hero needed to help someone else or find closure in some intangible journey of its own. Now it had returned, choosing their family once more. Over the weeks that followed, they reclaimed their sense of wholeness. Finalized the scholarship plans. Todd immersed himself in volunteer work, forging deeper connections with the community. Continued writing, her pieces shining with a newfound empathy and emotional resonance that readers devoured. And Hero, though carrying a few scars from its mysterious absence, remained the steadfast heart of the household. To onlookers, it was just a dog. It was an angel, a reminder that love and healing can appear in the of forms, at the of times. Some stories simply defy explanation. They weave fate and coincidence so tightly that the difference between the two becomes irrelevant. And so it was with the stray dog that walked into the home. It began with a scratch at the door on a rainy night, a moment so mundane and easily overlooked. But what unfolded next was anything but ordinary. A hidden box unearthed from the roots of an ancient oak, letters that revealed a lifetime of secrets, a con artist outsmarted, and a family's wounds finally given the salve of truth and acceptance. The dog's role was to guide, to protect, and perhaps to remind them that sometimes miracles do walk on four legs, tails wagging, ready to show us the path to redemption. In the end, they discovered that the most shocking part of their story wasn't the inheritance or the buried letters. It was the realization that a love once lost could be honored rather than hidden, that healing could come from the most unexpected visitor. People from around the world read this viral article and found hope in their own hardships. Scholarship lifted young lives, a testament to the child she never had the chance to raise. And Todd, once withdrawn behind his headphones, learned that opening one's heart to kindness could be the bravest act of all. They were a family reinvented, stronger, more united. Hero remained a steadfast presence, lying at its feet as she sipped tea in the quiet mornings, or trotting alongside as she sought new stories to tell, or curling up with Todd when he listened to music late into the night. Whenever the dog gazed at them, there was a profound softness in its eyes, an unspoken thank you. But in truth, it was the who were grateful beyond measure. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a glimpse into the infinite ways love can reach us, even through a stray dog's gentle paws on a stormy night. And that is how a single moment, a dog walking into a house under cover of darkness, transformed grief into revelation, secrecy into honesty, and heartbreak into a chance at profound healing. The echo of that transformation continues, growing louder each time someone reads their story, feels the tug of emotion, and dares to believe that no matter how lost we feel, no matter how locked away our secrets may be, a simple knock at the door can change everything. Even today, if you were to pass by the home, you might catch a glimpse of and Hero sitting together on the porch at twilight, silhouettes against the fading sky. And maybe, just maybe, you'd feel that same electric sense of wonder that first flickered the night Hero arrived, carrying hope in every careful step, proving once and for all that miracles truly do exist in the most unassuming of forms.